Marissa had been a third-grade teacher at Brookwood Elementary for nearly 7 years. Her classroom walls were covered in colorful drawings, spelling charts, and motivational quotes carefully chosen to inspire young minds. She organized reading corners, brought snacks for students who forgot theirs, and stayed late to grade homework or prepare lesson plans. To her colleagues she was dedicated. To students she was kind. To parents she was reassuring. In staff meetings, she volunteered for committees without being asked. When new teachers arrived, she was the first to offer guidance. And at school events, she always seemed to be right in the middle of things, helping, chatting, smiling. In a town like Cedar Ridge, word travels fast. But when the words spoken are positive, no one questions their source. Parents praised her. Kids talked about her in the car ride home. The principal once referred to her as a pillar of consistency. No one imagined that anything about her life or work might one day be questioned. If there were shadows in the story, no one had noticed yet. For a long time, nothing seemed out of place. Marissa's reputation was built slowly, year after year, through field trips, report cards, open house nights, and cheerful greetings at the classroom door. She remembered birthdays and sometimes wrote personal notes of encouragement to students who struggled. One parent recalled how Marissa helped her shy daughter come out of her shell by assigning her simple group tasks and praising her effort. Another mentioned how she donated supplies for families who couldn't afford them. The small acts added up, creating an image of a teacher who not only did her job but cared deeply about it. Yet many stories that begin with admiration take unexpected turns. And sometimes those turns don't start with loud alarms. They start with small whispers, quiet observations, and moments that only seem meaningful in hindsight. In the fall of what would become the most turbulent year in Brookwood Elementary's history, a few parents began to notice subtle changes in their children. Nothing dramatic at first. Just hints of discomfort or questions that felt slightly unusual. One mother mentioned during a casual conversation that her son had become quieter about school. He didn't seem afraid, but he no longer talked about his day the way he used to. Another parent found her daughter unusually reluctant to attend an after-school session Marissa had suggested. The child didn't elaborate. She simply said she didn't want to stay late anymore. At the time, the mother assumed it was fatigue or moodiness. Life with children often presents moments that defy explanation, and most parents chalk it up to growing pains. Around the same time, one of the school custodians noticed Marissa spending more time than usual in certain unused rooms after hours. Teachers often stayed late, especially during grading periods or before parent conferences, so the behavior didn't immediately raise concern. But the frequency and the locations, storage rooms or areas not typically associated with lesson planning, caught quiet attention. Still no one spoke up. Without context, unusual behavior can look harmless. The principal, Leonard Mathis, maintained his confidence in Marissa. He had observed her classes several times over the years and never found reason to question her professionalism. He remembered her quick wit during staff meetings, the gratitude parents expressed during conferences, and the positive tone of her evaluations. From his perspective, she was an asset to the school, someone who made his job easier. The first formal concern came unexpectedly, not from a teacher or staff member, but from a parent who had always supported the school. She called the administrative office one morning, requesting a brief conversation with the principal. During their meeting, seated across from his desk with quiet composure, she explained that her daughter had made a few unsettling statements at home. The child mentioned private help sessions that didn't involve other students and said Marissa often closed the classroom door during these times. There was no direct accusation, only discomfort and uncertainty. The mother asked if this was common practice. Principal Mathis assured her that teachers occasionally held one-on-one sessions, especially with students needing help, but he promised to look into it. At first, he didn't assume wrongdoing. Instead, he planned a gentle inquiry, perhaps a casual observation or a conversation framed around academic support. But before he had a chance to act, another parent scheduled a meeting, and then another. Anxiety doesn't always erupt suddenly. Sometimes it emerges through accumulation. 3 parents, each with their own set of concerns, came forward within a 2-week span. None of them used words like danger or abuse. Instead, they spoke of unusual meeting times, abrupt mood changes in their children, or small comments that hinted at unease. One father mentioned his son seemed nervous when discussing school, a word that made the principal pause. Mathis consulted the school counselor, hoping for perspective. The counselor noted that children can react strongly to stress, family issues, or academic pressure, and she suggested that intervention should be cautious. But she agreed that patterns, even subtle ones, shouldn't be dismissed. The turning point came when a 4th parent reached out, this time sending an email late at night. In it, she mentioned something her child had said that didn't align with typical classroom routines. She used the words concerned and confused, and she asked whether certain spaces within the school were monitored after hours. It wasn't an accusation, but it was a signal. At that point, Principal Mathis decided not to rely solely on assumptions. He contacted the district superintendent, explaining the situation in measured terms. He didn't use Marissa's name in an accusatory way. He simply stated that some parents had mentioned behavior that warranted internal review. The superintendent advised him to proceed discreetly, without confrontation, and to ensure that any observations were documented. Meanwhile, the school day continued as usual. Students filled the halls, teachers prepared lessons, and Marissa continued her routines. She smiled in the hallways, chatted in the break room, and left notes on her whiteboard reminding students about reading assignments. If anything weighed on her, no one noticed. Her demeanor remained consistent with the reputation she had built over years. But beneath the calm surface of daily life, a quiet tension had begun to form. The administration arranged for subtle check-ins and routine classroom walkthroughs. Nothing overt, nothing that would alarm anyone. The custodian who had noticed her late visits to unused rooms mentioned to his supervisor that the behavior continued. The supervisor, unsure of its importance but aware of the principal's inquiry, passed it along. Around this time, surveillance footage became part of the administrative review. Schools often have cameras in common areas and hallways, not to intrude on privacy, but to ensure safety. The principal and a district representative reviewed segments of footage, not searching for something specific, but scanning for anything out of place. Initially, there was nothing remarkable. Teachers often stayed late, and movement between rooms wasn't uncommon. Yet in one clip, recorded on a Wednesday evening, Marissa was seen entering a storage room carrying a small bag and closing the door behind her. She remained out of view for nearly 20 minutes. On its own, the footage proved nothing. But in light of growing concerns, it stood out. Still, administrations move carefully. The principal didn't confront Marissa immediately, choosing instead to consult with legal counsel for the district. They advised caution and documentation, stressing that any action should protect students while respecting due process. They also recommended speaking with the school's resource officer, a liaison to local law enforcement. When the officer was briefed, he listened without interruption. His expression didn't reveal judgment, only attentiveness. He asked for details, names, dates, the nature of parental concerns, and any available documentation. He reminded the administrators that unusual behavior doesn't automatically indicate criminal conduct, but he also noted that patterns of secrecy warrant attention. At this stage, no formal investigation had begun. There were no charges, no interviews with Marissa, no search of personal belongings. But the atmosphere around the issue had shifted from curiosity to guarded vigilance. The principal, once confident in his staff, found himself re-examining memories and conversations. Had he ever overlooked something? Had friendliness and familiarity clouded his judgment? The parents who had come forward continued with their lives, unsure of what might come next. They hadn't accused her of anything specific, and some even doubted whether they had misunderstood their children. But their intuition, driven by care and fear, had spoken loudly enough to begin a chain of events. For Marissa, The days remained unchanged on the surface. She assigned homework, graded spelling tests, and wrote encouraging comments in margins. When passing colleagues in the hallway, she offered brief smiles or light conversation. If whispers circulated, she didn't appear aware of them. But in stories like this, perception is rarely the full picture. What lies beneath often takes time to surface, and the truth, when it emerges, does not always appear in one sudden moment. Sometimes it arrives in fragments, drawn together by people who refuse to ignore their uncertainty. By late autumn, the situation at Brookwood Elementary had quietly moved beyond informal concern. The administration, now in coordination with district officials and local authorities, prepared to take the next steps, carefully, discreetly, and with a growing awareness that the story unfolding in their midst might be far more complex than anyone had imagined. In the days that followed, the school counselor began gently checking in with students who had been mentioned by their parents. The approach was subtle, casual conversations disguised as routine wellness checkups. She asked about school, friendships, homework, and after-school activities, watching for signs of discomfort. Some children shared little. Others hesitated when certain topics surfaced. And a few referenced one-on-one sessions with Marissa in ways that made the counselor pause, not because the children seemed frightened, but because they seemed uncertain about what was normal. She documented everything carefully, using neutral language, avoiding assumptions. In her training, she had learned that children often communicate anxiety not through specific words but through tone, hesitations, or changes in behavior. Those subtleties, she knew, could indicate something deeper, or nothing at all. But they couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, the school resource officer contacted a detective from the local police department, someone experienced in handling sensitive cases involving minors. They agreed to keep their involvement quiet until more clarity emerged. The goal was not to create panic or target any individual prematurely, but to ensure that if something serious was occurring, it would not continue unchecked. The detective requested access to school logs, room usage schedules, after-hours entry records, and any relevant digital communication between staff and students' families. He didn't involve Marissa directly, not yet. Instead, he worked quietly, piecing together timelines and patterns. He noticed that several after-school help sessions weren't documented in any official calendar, and there were instances where classroom doors had been locked outside regular hours, something against school policy unless permissions were granted. At the same time, the principal wrestled with his own doubts. He replayed past interactions in his mind, searching for red flags he might have missed. He remembered her laughter during staff appreciation dinners, the way she offered to take extra recess duty without complaint, the thank you notes from parents at the end of each school year. It seemed impossible that someone so embedded in the fabric of their school community could be at the center of such suspicions. And yet, the whispers were growing too consistent to ignore. As Thanksgiving break approached, the detective and the resource officer met with a child advocacy specialist. They discussed how best to proceed if formal interviews became necessary. The specialist emphasized that timing and environment mattered, that children should not feel interrogated or pressured. Everything would have to be conducted legally, ethically, and sensitively. The district's legal counsel then advised that, given the mounting concerns, Marissa should be placed on a form of administrative leave, quietly and with as little disruption as possible. They recommended framing it as a temporary reassignment for professional review, a standard approach in cases where complaints surfaced but guilt had not been established. When the principal called Marissa into his office one afternoon, he kept his expression even. He informed her that a procedural review involving multiple staff members was being conducted and that she would be temporarily relieved of classroom duties with full pay. He did not accuse her of misconduct, nor did he reference any specific parent concerns. She appeared surprised, maybe confused, but not outwardly alarmed. She asked only if she had done something wrong. He told her the leave was standard and non-disciplinary. She gathered a few personal items from her desk and left the school quietly, offering a polite smile to a colleague who passed her in the hallway. Some staff noticed her absence the next day and asked questions, but the administration offered only vague explanations about reassignment and scheduling adjustments. During her absence, substitute teachers filled her classroom, and students reacted with mixed emotions. Some asked when she would return. Others seemed indifferent. A few appeared relieved, though they couldn't articulate why. Outside the walls of the school, the investigation deepened. The detective obtained a warrant to review Marissa's school-issued email account and digital records. He found several messages to parents that seemed routine: updates about assignments, reminders for field trips, notes of encouragement. But scattered among them were exchanges that raised questions. She had occasionally contacted certain parents directly about arranging individual sessions after hours, without copying administrators or using official scheduling channels. In one email, she reassured a parent that extra time with a particular student would stay between us to avoid confusion. The language was ambiguous. It could have referred to avoiding scheduling mix-ups, or it could have implied secrecy. Interpretation depended on intent, and intent is often the hardest thing to prove. The detective also examined access logs from the school's electronic entry system. On multiple evenings after cleaning staff had left, Marissa's keycard had been used to unlock the West Wing hallway and adjacent rooms not typically associated with after-hours work. There were no sign-out records or official reasons provided. When investigators quietly brought in the custodian for questioning, he explained what he had observed. He was careful with his words, not wanting to speculate or damage anyone's reputation. But he confirmed that on several occasions, he had seen her entering unused rooms and closing the door. He didn't know why and had not intervened. At the time, he assumed she was retrieving supplies or preparing for the next day. His account was handwritten, signed, and added to the case file. As more fragments accumulated, the detective sought permission to conduct preliminary interviews with the children whose parents had expressed concern. These interviews were held in a neutral location, facilitated by the child advocacy specialist. The sessions were calm, structured to avoid leading questions. Some children provided vague answers. Others spoke about being asked to stay behind when other students were dismissed. A few mentioned being taken to rooms that weren't their regular classrooms. None of the children used alarming language directly, and none described explicit wrongdoing. But their combined accounts painted a picture of confusion, discomfort, and secrecy. One child used the word weird repeatedly. Another said they didn't like when the door was shut but didn't know if it was allowed to say no. Still another mentioned being told that other teachers wouldn't understand the help they were getting. Individually, the comments lacked clarity. Together, they raised the level of suspicion significantly. Parents were not yet informed of the interviews, and no public announcement had been made. The district and investigators agreed that moving too quickly or carelessly could jeopardize both the rights of the accused and the safety of the children. The situation required balance. One misstep could erode trust completely, regardless of the outcome. During this time, Marissa remained at home. She checked in with colleagues occasionally by text, mentioning she hoped the review would be resolved soon. She did not express frustration openly, at least not in messages obtained by investigators. Some co-workers speculated privately that she might be overwhelmed or facing personal issues, but no one spoke to her directly about the rumors beginning to circulate. By early winter, the detective compiled a report outlining the preliminary findings. He presented it to the district attorney's office for review. The DA's team examined the evidence: digital logs, testimonies, surveillance footage, emails, and interview notes. They debated whether the material justified formal charges or whether further investigation was needed. Ultimately, they agreed there was enough concern to warrant a search of her personal belongings kept on school property and a closer analysis of her digital communications. They sought a narrowly tailored warrant, emphasizing the sensitivity of the situation. When the search took place, it was done quietly after school hours, with only a handful of authorized personnel present. In Marissa's classroom desk and personal storage cabinet, they found notebooks with handwritten notes about certain students, comments about behavior, family situations, and emotional states. While teachers often keep such notes for planning and support, some entries seemed unusually focused, detailing private conversations and observations not shared with other staff. Investigators also found a flash drive in a small box labeled with her initials. It contained lesson materials, photos from class events, and files titled with students' first names. Some of the documents appeared harmless: reading exercises, homework sheets, group activity templates. But a few files contained annotations that raised more questions than answers. The discovery of these items did not, on its own, prove criminal behavior. But it added weight to the growing concern that something inappropriate might have been occurring beyond the standard responsibilities of a teacher. After reviewing the materials, the detective and DA's office determined that Marissa should be called in for questioning. They planned the interview carefully, not as an arrest, but as a voluntary conversation. She would be informed of her rights and allowed to have legal representation if she chose. When contacted, Marissa agreed to meet. She arrived at the station calmly, accompanied by an attorney she had retained after being placed on leave. She answered some questions and declined others, deferring to legal counsel. She denied doing anything improper and said any private sessions were meant to support struggling students whose parents had approved extra help. She claimed that locking doors was a safety measure to keep hallways secure after hours. When asked why certain rooms were used, she said she sometimes needed quiet space away from interruptions. Her attorney emphasized that no student had made explicit accusations and that assumptions were being drawn from misinterpretations. He argued that dedicated teachers often go above and beyond, and that suspicion alone was not evidence. The interview ended without incident. She was not arrested or charged that day. But the process had begun, and in the eyes of investigators, the case was no longer a matter of vague concern. It was formally active. News of the inquiry had not yet reached the broader community, but the circle of awareness around the situation was widening. The district prepared statements in case the story became public, and the school board quietly scheduled meetings to discuss protocols and potential next steps. Inside Cedar Ridge, life continued with the illusion of normalcy. But beneath that calm exterior, uncertainty had taken hold. The image of trust that once sheltered Marissa Lane was beginning to fracture, not with a dramatic break, but with careful, deliberate investigation that had only just begun to reveal what might lie beneath the surface. As winter settled over Cedar Ridge, the silence surrounding the investigation began to feel heavier. The administration continued to operate under a carefully worded policy of non-disclosure, and the district maintained that the situation was under internal review. Yet, the absence of clear communication can create its own noise, and speculation, like wind slipping through cracks, began to move through staff rooms and sheltered conversations. Teachers who had once joked with Marissa in the break room now avoided mentioning her name unless someone else brought it up first. A few still believed the matter was an overreaction, a misunderstanding that would clear in time. Others, more cautious or perceptive, noticed inconsistencies in stories or glimpses of tension that now seemed meaningful. When colleagues share a workplace for years, they collect impressions, some accurate, some imagined, and those impressions resurfaced in quiet recollections. Parents whose children had not been interviewed continued their daily routines, unaware of the growing inquiry. They packed lunches, attended basketball practices, and reminded their kids to finish homework. The calm before awareness is rarely recognized as calm until it's gone. At the district attorney's office, the case file expanded. Investigators began looking into Marissa's background, previous schools, work history, references on file. They requested transcripts of her hiring records, performance evaluations, and any prior complaints, formal or informal. Most documents painted a picture of competence. There were no disciplinary actions or notes of concern in her employment history. Her references from earlier roles described her as attentive and reliable. That lack of precedent made the unfolding events harder to interpret. The detective spoke again with the child advocacy specialist, reviewing interview transcripts. They noticed a pattern. Several students used words indicating secrecy or exclusivity, even without describing direct acts of harm. One mentioned being told they were different and needed help in a special way. Another said they were asked not to tell classmates they stayed late. Investigators knew that children often lack vocabulary to articulate troubling experiences, but recurring themes can signal something deeper. Through legal channels, authorities obtained permission to examine Marissa's personal electronic devices. Her attorney pushed back, arguing there was no probable cause sufficient to justify such a search. After debate, a judge granted a limited warrant restricted to school-related communications involving minors. Within those parameters, investigators examined text messages and apps connected to her school communications account. Some messages mirrored the email patterns: friendly, supportive, seemingly in line with extra academic help. Still, there were moments of wording that hinted at blurred boundaries: private encouragement beyond professional tone, assurances that certain sessions wouldn't be interrupted, and suggestions that students could talk to her about things they didn't feel comfortable sharing with others. Meanwhile, the principal struggled with the weight of divided responsibility: protecting students, respecting due process, and maintaining order within the school. He stopped short of sharing the full extent of the situation with teachers, but he quietly instructed staff to avoid private one-on-one sessions with students behind closed doors unless another adult was nearby. He framed the guidance as a general policy update, though some teachers suspected it was connected to Marissa's sudden absence. During this period, district officials discussed protocol. If the case escalated and became public, they would need a statement emphasizing the presumption of innocence while affirming the district's obligation to protect students. They drafted and revised language repeatedly. Phrases like ongoing review, student safety priority, and full cooperation with authorities appeared in multiple versions. In January, as students returned from winter break, the substitute teacher assigned to Marissa's class tried to create an atmosphere of continuity. She used the same seating charts, followed lesson plans left behind, and tried to maintain the routines students recognized. Even so, some children asked when their teacher was coming back. The substitute offered gentle, non-specific answers. Younger students tended to accept them without question. Older ones whispered among themselves. Back at the DA's office, the investigative team prepared to consult with forensic analysts regarding the electronic materials retrieved. They wanted to confirm whether any deleted files might be recovered, and whether location data might place Marissa and specific students in the same areas at unusual times. During one meeting, the detective raised a question that shifted the tone of the inquiry. Were there potential witnesses among faculty who might have noticed something but dismissed it as inconsequential? He suggested interviewing teachers not about accusations, but about their observations regarding patterns, room usage, and student behavior. The first staff member questioned was a teacher who shared a hallway with Marissa. She said she had occasionally noticed Marissa working late, but assumed it was due to grading or holiday preparation. When asked if she had ever seen students with her after hours, she hesitated. She recalled one evening when she returned to retrieve a forgotten coat and saw a child leaving a nearby room. She greeted them, but the moment passed quickly, and she didn't think to inquire further. Another teacher remembered Marissa requesting to borrow her key to access a storage area months earlier. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now mentioned that Marissa seemed unusually hurried and didn't explain why she needed the space. None of these statements were damning, but they added to a mosaic investigators were slowly assembling: pieces of time, access, and intent. Parents of students who had been interviewed were privately updated and given the option to pursue counseling for their children. Some accepted immediately. Others hesitated, uncertain how to discuss the matter with their families. The district assured them that no conclusions had been reached and emphasized confidentiality. Even so, the secrecy unsettled some, who began to fear that silence might indicate severity. Marissa, confined by circumstance and legal guidance, kept a low profile. She rarely left home except for necessities. Her attorney advised against discussing the case with anyone, including friends or former colleagues. She spent much of her time reviewing old lesson plans and communicating only through formal channels. Whether she felt anger, fear, confusion, or resignation remained unclear to observers. As weeks passed, the detective revisited the initial interviews with students to ensure accuracy and context. One statement in particular stood out, a quiet mention by a child describing how they were told that some people might not understand why they were chosen for extra help. The phrase echoed in the detective's mind, prompting him to question whether the selection of students followed any visible pattern: academics, behavior, vulnerability, or something else. With a team of analysts, they began mapping data: names, ages, schedules, parent concerns, timelines, room usage, and access logs. Patterns began to emerge. A small group of students appeared more frequently in connection with Marissa's unscheduled sessions. Their parents had been among those who first voiced discomfort. Their interviews had contained similar wording about secrecy or confusion. The detective presented his findings to the DA's office. The evidence still lacked clarity in terms of explicit action, but it demonstrated a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. The DA's team debated next steps. Should they move forward with charges based on circumstantial patterns and implied misconduct? Or should they delay until more conclusive evidence surfaced? Ultimately, they decided to expand the investigation, conducting follow-up interviews with students, now accompanied by more targeted but still ethically appropriate questions. They also sought to determine whether any physical evidence existed in the unused rooms Marissa had accessed. The school granted permission for a detailed inspection of those rooms. With the custodian's assistance, investigators examined storage areas and multipurpose rooms. They looked for signs of recent activity: moved furniture, misplaced items, personal belongings, writing materials, anything that seemed out of place. In one room, they found a folding chair positioned oddly behind a stack of boxes. Nearby, a small whiteboard bore faint writing marks that someone had partially erased. None of it proved wrongdoing, but context mattered. As the search continued, a locker assigned to Marissa in the staff area was examined with appropriate authorization. Inside were personal effects: a sweater, pens, notebooks, and a stack of folders. Most contained lesson materials. However, one folder included printed pages with students' names and personal notes not listed in official school records. These notes commented on emotional states, fears, and home life details students had mentioned in confidence. While teachers often make observations to support students, investigators questioned why these notes were not shared with counselors or administrators. The secrecy suggested something beyond typical practice. Still, interpretation required caution. The pressure of the investigation began to affect those involved. The principal felt the weight of hindsight pressing harder each day. The school counselor worried about the students who had been interviewed, whether the process might cause confusion or distress. Parents who had been contacted felt trapped between wanting answers and fearing what those answers might reveal. In late February, after weeks of additional analysis, the DA's office decided to move forward. They drafted formal charges rooted in the misuse of authority, inappropriate conduct with minors, and creating unsafe conditions within an educational setting. The wording was carefully chosen, reflecting the evidence available without overstating what could not yet be proven. On the morning the charges were filed, law enforcement notified Marissa's attorney and requested that she surrender herself willingly. She arrived at the station accompanied by counsel, maintaining a composed expression. The booking process was professional and discreet, shielded from the public eye as much as possible. By afternoon, news of her arrest began to spread, not through official channels at first, but through whispers, sudden phone calls, and messages exchanged among parents and staff. The school district, caught between confidentiality obligations and growing speculation, released a short statement acknowledging that a teacher had been placed on leave pending legal proceedings and that authorities were involved. They did not name Marissa publicly, but in a town like Cedar Ridge, connecting the dots required minimal effort. The story, once confined to cautious administrators and investigators, had begun to break into the open. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Some residents reacted with disbelief, defending her character. Others, recalling small moments of unease they had set aside, began to wonder if their instincts had been signaling danger all along. Yet even as the story emerged from the shadows, it was far from complete. The court process had yet to begin, evidence had not been presented in full, and the truth, whatever shape it would ultimately take, remained beyond the grasp of rumor and assumption. In that uncertain space between accusation and resolution, the case of Marissa Lane moved from quiet investigation to public reckoning, and Cedar Ridge braced for the impact of revelations still to come. In the days following Marissa Lane's arrest, Cedar Ridge found itself caught between disbelief and grim acknowledgement. Conversations that once circled around school events, weekend plans, and neighborhood news now turned cautiously toward the unfolding case. Some residents spoke in whispers, convinced there had to be more to the story than anyone yet understood. Others, shaken by the thought that warning signs might have been overlooked, began reassessing past interactions through a sharper lens. Parents whose children had been interviewed moved quietly through their routines, balancing concern with the instinct to shield their kids from confusion or fear. Some felt relief that authorities were taking the matter seriously. Others resented the silence that had surrounded the investigation for so long. With no official verdict and few public details, families filled the gaps with questions that had no immediate answers. At Brookwood Elementary, the atmosphere shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Hallways that once echoed with familiar rhythms now carried an undercurrent of unease. The substitute teacher in Marissa's classroom did her best to maintain consistency, yet students occasionally mentioned their former teacher with a mix of curiosity and confusion. Younger children asked when she might return. Older ones sensed the tension in the adults around them and kept their questions to themselves. Among faculty, reactions varied. Some colleagues remained defensive, insisting Marissa had never shown signs of misconduct. They remembered her staying late to prepare lesson plans, tutoring students who struggled, or organizing small group activities to boost confidence. Others, quietly reflecting on past encounters, wondered whether unusual moments they had dismissed now held meaning they failed to see. The line between hindsight and guilt blurred in the minds of those who had shared her workspace. Meanwhile, the district's leadership faced mounting pressure. Reporters began calling the superintendent's office, requesting confirmation, comment, or clarification. Statements were carefully worded, emphasizing cooperation with authorities, the presumption of innocence, and a continued focus on student well-being. Yet each public phrase left as many questions as answers, and community members pressed for transparency without fully understanding the legal limits that bound the district's response. At the courthouse, preliminary hearings moved forward. Marissa, accompanied by her attorney, appeared composed but distant, acknowledging the proceedings without visible emotion. The charges, rooted in abuse of authority and inappropriate conduct toward minors, were read in a matter-of-fact tone. She entered a plea of not guilty. Her attorney argued there was insufficient evidence of criminal behavior, citing a lack of definitive proof of physical misconduct. Prosecutors countered with the pattern of secrecy, the accounts of multiple students, and the nature of her communications with them. The judge acknowledged the gravity of the allegations and the procedural requirement to allow the case to proceed. Marissa was released on bond under strict conditions: no contact with minors, no entry onto school grounds, and no communication with former students or staff outside of legal representation. She returned home to a life defined by silence, legal consultations, and the quiet erosion of her public identity. For investigators, the next phase meant preparing evidence for trial. They continued reviewing interviews, digital materials, and records of Marissa's access to school facilities. While no single piece offered absolute clarity, the accumulation of details presented a portrait that prosecutors believed warranted judgment in court. In Cedar Ridge, the story spread beyond the school district. Local outlets began reporting the arrest, naming Marissa once her identity became public through legal documentation. The tone of coverage varied, some emphasizing the seriousness of the charges, others focusing on the community's shock. Social media amplified the story, often with speculation that outran facts. Some commenters condemned her immediately, while others insisted she had been targeted unfairly. Parents, students, and educators found themselves at the center of a conversation they did not ask to join. Some questioned how well schools could truly monitor staff behavior. Others worried the case would cast suspicion on teachers who had done nothing wrong. A few wondered how long the investigation had been underway before anyone outside the system was informed, and whether more transparency might have eased the shock. For students directly involved, counselors continued offering support. Some children expressed confusion. They remembered certain moments as special attention or extra help, not as something that might be considered harmful. Others had sensed discomfort but lacked the words to explain it. The emotional impact varied, as did the understanding of what the legal process might mean for them moving forward. In staff meetings held after hours, the principal encouraged vigilance and empathy in equal measure. He reminded teachers that they could not speak publicly about the case or the investigation, not only due to policy but to preserve the well-being of students whose statements had been crucial. Even so, the absence of closure weighed heavily on the faculty, many of whom feared that the public would judge them for not seeing more, knowing more, or acting sooner. As winter shifted slowly toward spring, the community settled uneasily into waiting. The legal process would unfold over months, not days. Evidence would be examined, witnesses identified, and expert testimony prepared. The verdict, whatever shape it ultimately took, would not come swiftly. For now, Marissa Lane remained neither convicted nor exonerated, suspended between the presumption of innocence and the gravity of the accusations against her. Her name, once associated with decorated bulletin boards and attentive teaching, now carried uncertainty and restraint. And in the absence of resolution, Cedar Ridge found itself grappling with a truth communities rarely face directly. Sometimes the most unsettling stories are not the ones with clear endings, but the ones that remain suspended in doubt, memory, and unanswered questions. Cases like this raise difficult questions. Tell us what you think in the comments.